As Roman already said, Robert Zoellick is a former World Bank president, U.S. Trade Representative, and Deputy Secretary of State. Last week, the Wall Street Journal carried his op-ed on Obama's Middle East escapism and what that means for U.S. interests globally. Elsewhere, Bob Zoellick has written about opportunities such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, North American energy innovation, and economic integration. We welcome Bob and Jerry Seib, Washington Bureau Chief for the Wall Street Journal, who is responsible for news and analysis from the Capitol. He's developed the digital edition of the Washington Bureau, which includes his own column, Capitol Journal. In 2012, he won the Loeb Lifetime Achievement Award for contributions to business and financial journalism, one of many prizes and awards that he has garnered. Gerald, Seib, Robert Zoellick, I welcome you to the podium, to the stage.
Well, Jerry and I agreed we didn't want to interrupt your meal, so please eat away. For those of you that chew loud, try to be a little quiet on that side. Because we wanted to spend as much time as we could with you. I want to thank all of you for the invitation, but more importantly, I want to thank you for your interest in this subject. Jerry and I have been involved in these issues from a Washington perspective for a number of years, but we also recognize that, frankly, the heart and support for any international engagement in the United States depends on what people across the country think. So the fact that you're involved and interested in shaping community opinion is very important, and that's why we wanted to spend some time with you. I also want to thank my friend Roman, because I had a chance to look a little bit at your program, and he's really managed to fill in every minute, as I'm sure you're well aware, but also do so with some really excellent people covering an impressive range of topics. It's a pleasure to be with Jerry. I actually, one of my first engagements actually was with Secretary James Baker at the Treasury Department, State Department, briefly at the White House. And Jerry at that time was actually covering foreign affairs for the Wall Street Journal, so was with us together on a plane for many hours at the end of the Cold War. But as you may know, Jerry was involved with the excellent Journal team that just worked on the Fox Journal debate of the Republican candidates, and Jerry helped work the undercard debate. This posed a little problem for me as I was up here, because I didn't know if I had to interrupt myself to be part of the debate process while speaking. I know your topic is sort of foreign policy challenges looking for the next to the next president, and obviously that's an extraordinarily wide-ranging topic. As I reflected on how I could be most helpful to you, I thought I might start with a bit of a framework, so as issues go forward in the months to come, that at least you can have one organizational approach. One common way to do this is to focus on the hot topics, and you've got them on your program. So whether it's the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, whether it's Russian revanchism, whether it's the rise of China, kind of a geographic issue focus. Another one, and knowing the fact that you come from diverse communities that people might have, is what sort of the cross-cutting issues. It might be cyber, it might be environmental, can be nuclear proliferation, can be women and gender issues, economics, movement of people, health. A lot of those I worked on quite closely from the World Bank perspective. I'm going to give you another framework, which is a bit of geopolitics with an infusion of economics and just a touch of history. I always enjoy history. That Jerry and I were talking about that at the table. And obviously, people approach this a little differently when they think about its importance for foreign policy. It was actually Edmund Burke, not Santayana, who first made the point about those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. Henry Ford had a different view. History is bunk. I've always kind of liked Mark Twain. Mark Twain had this expression that history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And what I actually found in my public sector career or others is that having some sense of history is important about the questions to ask or the context. And frankly, and I know we've got ambassadors from other countries here today, people from other lands often are quite sensitive to the historical experience, and they find that Americans often are a little slighting of that. So having some sense of how other people view issues historically is very important. Now, the term geopolitics, as some of you may know, actually dates back about 100 years ago with a gentleman named Sir Halford Mackinder, who was, not surprisingly, a geographer at Oxford, but also a member of Parliament. And he came up with an idea that was called the heartland theory. And it has a relevance to today because what he basically did, and this is unusual for someone from Britain, was, which always looked obviously at sort of a maritime perspective from the Royal Navy, was he said, look, if you look at the Eurasian landmass, that really represents a world island. And if you consider the resources and the people and the capabilities in that world island, whoever dominates the heartland of that space and that space is in a good position to control the world as a whole. So consider a little bit the possibilities from a North American or US perspective. The US is an island continent off that larger sort of world island. And part of the perspective for the United States is always to be able to have access, at a minimum, to the eastern and western frontiers of that world island. And also, from a protective sense, you never want one power or a combination of powers to be able to dominate it and exclude the United States. So this would have been Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It would have been the Soviet Union. A man named Spikeman came up with the idea of the rimland. So it's important to control the rim of this space. And there you would even think whether it was Imperial Germany in the Western Rim at the time of World War I, whether it's China today or China and Russia today. So it gives a bit of a sense about, from a geographic and political and power perspective, about U.S. interests. So to connect this to the U.S. experience, obviously for the United States, when it was finishing the basic settlement of the continental territory at the end of the 19th century, it starts to look abroad in a broader maritime power sense. This is associated, some of you will have read about Alfred Thayer Mahan, who wrote about the influence of sea power on history. After World War I, with the breakdown of the economic and political system, you had a breakdown in the security system. So moving fast here, at the end of World War II, there was a geopolitical perspective of the United States that said, we have to learn the lessons of the 20s and 30s of economics, but also geopolitical security lessons. So on the economic side, you have the Marshall Plan. You have the IMF to deal with exchange rates and currency. You have the GATT and later the WTO to fight trade protectionism. You have the World Bank dealing with reconstruction and development. And in a sense, the designers of those systems were not really focused on the Soviet Union. They were really focused on what had happened in the 20s and 30s and tried to avoid a breakdown of the international economy that would lead to a political and security breakdown. On the security side, however, you have the creation of NATO, so the link with the Western European rimland. And in the Pacific, you have Japan, Korea, Australia, Thailand, the Philippines, so a security structure that covers both the Pacific and the Atlantic. Also during this period, you have the rise of a recognition of the importance of the Middle Eastern Gulf. And this was driven in part by energy, as the major source of producer of energy, part driven by a sense of moral and security connection to Israel. And it also has a maritime component because this is the southern flank of continental Europe, as the Europeans are seeing today with the refugee crisis. And it's also the Suez Canal and the link to the Persian Gulf. So this was the world that I really grew up and studied before I entered public service. And it was the world that I was fortunate enough to be kind of part of ending with the end of the Cold War, when Jerry covered the State Department and I worked for Secretary Baker. So you have the end of the division of Europe, a Europe whole and free, a surprise to all of us, frankly, the breakup of the Soviet Union. But also you have a couple of other things going down. You have Deng Xiaoping in 1978 and 80 launch a very different approach for China than Russia, where he's maintaining the strength of the Communist Party but opening up the political economy. And you also have the rise of what some have called from the G7 to the G20, the globalization movement and the opportunity for many developing countries to have greater influence in the international system. On September 11th, we have a new phase, Islamic terrorism, beginning a series of long wars with a sense for people for some people, a sense of fatigue. And one of the big discussions you'll hear today is if the pendulum of security activism swung too far in the Bush 43 years, has it swung too far back at this period? And what does that mean for the U.S. role in the world? So the key point that I think we face as a country is how do we adapt this international architecture that was developed and repaired over some 70 years to the challenges of today? I'd start first at home. And clearly, a strong U.S. economy is going to be key to our role internationally. This is not just a matter of resources or credit or dealing with the debt, but there's another element that I encounter really almost every month because I spend a lot of time abroad, and that is part of the United States' influence in the world stems from the dynamism of the country, the innovation, the ability to reinvent itself, its adaptability. I can really tell you from country after country I've worked with, and I've visited almost all of them, people are always surprised that the United States seems to have this cacophony of trouble and debate, but somehow it seems to kind of pull itself out of that process. And that's a process of reinvention. My own personal view is that I think the openness of the U.S. system is also critically important, whether it's trade or capital or ideas, whether it's people, because any system can make mistakes, but if you've got an open system, it's frankly much more likely you'll identify the mistakes and you'll repair them. So if you think about this in many aspects of your life, whether it's openness to information and competition is a critical dimension. Next thing I would focus on, and you don't hear as much attention to this, although I hope we hear more of it in the political debate, is North America. Most of the people that work on North America are either specialists with Mexico or Canada. In the course of the past year, former General Petraeus and I chaired a Council on Foreign Relations task force on North America. But we took a different perspective. We wanted to look at North America in a global context. We wanted to say, what could be the continental base for the United States, Mexico, and Canada to strengthen us globally? So just to put the seed of this thought in your mind, imagine 3 democracies, about 500 million people, energy self-sufficiency and perhaps ability to export, increasingly integrated economies, and if we particularly pay attention to infrastructure and border crossings, that in the case of Mexico, 40 cents out of every dollar they export is U.S. product, 25% from Canada. The equivalent number in China would be about 7 cents of each export comes from U.S. input. And a very hot topic that Jerry just dealt with, people. If you look at the demographics of North America, they're far better than China, Japan, Europe. And the question is, can we look upon people as human capital and the idea that whether they become citizens or not, you've got greater mobility to work and tap this as a human resource. So those are some of the issues that could be on the agenda with North America. And there's another part that flows from it. Canada has obviously been a U.S. ally, a partner in close cooperation since the start of the 20th century. When I first started working with Mexico in the mid-'80s, if you wanted to know Mexican foreign policy, you looked at U.S. foreign policy and you put a minus sign in front of it. And that was because the old Mexican foreign ministry was basically a place where leftist intellectuals were put by the PRI and they could indulge in anti-Americanism. When I was at USTR, my closest compatriots around the world were the Mexican and Canadian trade representatives. And you could start to see this, obviously, even move to some of the security topics. The cooperation with Mexico, I think, could advance much further. And it adds to one other geopolitical aspect that if we were in this room or a similar room at the start of the 20th century would have been on people's mind, but now we kind of ignore. And that is, we have a southern flank too. In the 19th century, this was the course of invasion. One of you is from New Orleans. You remember about the invasion coming up for the Battle of New Orleans. But now it's a question of people, organized crime, narcotics, and so the Caribbean basin as a whole, Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean islands, that's important to a modern version of U.S. security. And frankly, I think Mexico and Canada can be partners in that. So looking beyond those topics, we come back to the geographic position of the Atlantic and the Pacific. Well, let's start with the economics. Part of the debate about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, is will we have a modernized set of economic rules that link us to these prime economic partners, but also prime geopolitical partners. It's partly about opening markets, but as you may hear over the course of the discussions over the next couple of days, it's also who's going to determine some of the rules in some of these new areas. So it's not just tariff barriers or quotas, but it's a question of intellectual property rights, transparency, some of the environmental topics. The trade agreements in the modern era are ranging much more widely. Then there's the security links. Well, let's start on the Pacific. Some of you may have noticed that Prime Minister Abe of Japan recently changed some of the Japanese security provisions. That was quite important. Many of us were worried about this for years because it probably a surprise to many people. Japan's security obligations were really, the U.S. ran one way to Japan, not the reverse. So you could have had a situation where a Japanese ship is next to a U.S. ship, the U.S. ship is under attack, but it's not related to Japan, and under the old rules, Japan wouldn't come to support the U.S. ship. And you can imagine how long the U.S.-Japan alliance would have worked in that environment. So that's one change that's been made. But there's other changes with Australia and South Korea and others. And this is important because China is obviously a very significant issue. Which direction will it go? The rise of China. When I start with China, I start by thinking about our partners because we're going to be more effective if we work with our partners in the area. And that includes India, a very interesting country in terms of economic reform. One there, the Bush administration, Bush 43, kind of started to launch a partnership. You can never call it an alliance because the Indians are very sensitive to sort of being seen as a junior partner. But that'll be an important issue sort of going forward. Well, what about China? There's obviously differences in terms of cybersecurity, South China Sea, a fundamental principle for the U.S., freedom of navigation as a maritime power. A lot of resources move through the South China Sea. But interestingly enough, as you start to look further away from Asia, there's some possibilities for cooperation in security areas, whether it be Pakistan, whether it be Iran, whether it be Afghanistan, whether it be Africa. And on the economic subject, you get a very mixed picture as well. The Chinese are in the process of a huge structural transformation, where after 30 years of 10% a year growth, they realize they have to change the economic model. It's not easy. Move from exports and investment driven to consumption and greater domestic demand. And this has opportunities for U.S. service industries and others. So one of the challenges we come back to if you want, or you'll hear probably in the discussion, is how do you get that balance with China, working with your partners, where there are mutual interests to pursue, but frankly, there's also risks in the process. Links to Europe. This has a nice loop back to the experience that I mentioned at the end of the Cold War. I was the lead U.S. negotiator in the 2+4 negotiations, working for Secretary Baker and President Bush on German unification. And part of our strong commitment with Helmut Kohl was not only the fact that for 40 years we'd pledged our support to German unification, but we were also looking ahead. And we recognized that Germany would become the most powerful country in Europe, and therefore a good U.S.-German strategic relationship was very important. Now, for various reasons over the past 25 years, that relationship wasn't fulfilled to the degree at least that I think that it could be. But the financial crisis really highlighted this brutal fact of life, that Germany is dominant, but it doesn't want to be seen as dominating. And Germany, of course, wants to work the European institutions, the European Union and NATO. Some of those are facing some pretty big challenges. So obviously you follow what happened in Greece and questions with the Eurozone. Well, that game isn't finished yet. So how will Europe deal with that? The refugee issue is obviously goes to another core issue of the European Union, the free movement of people. And there's a third one that's also in the news just this week, which is Great Britain is trying to sort of renegotiate its arrangement. And it has not only issues that are related to Britain, but a core question for the non-Eurozone members of the European Union. Up to this point, the European Union had worked under the, at least, belief that it'll be ever closer and everybody will eventually come into the system. With the financial crisis, it's quite clear that the Eurozone countries are going to have to deepen their cooperation in different ways. And Britain, for the first time, as opposed to resisting that, said, we understand that, you go ahead, but what will be the perspective of the non-Eurozone members? So you have the Swedish ambassador here. He will tell you this is also part of the story that they face. What will Europe do with the changes in Russia? This is partly an issue of Ukraine, where Russia has not only taken Crimea, but in my view wants to preserve a frozen conflict to the east. The real challenge for Ukraine is not only Russia, it's a question of whether Ukraine will deal with the political and economic reforms so it becomes a successful economy and a successful democracy. The question of the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, which the United States all throughout the period of the Cold War never recognized as being absorbed in the Soviet Union, now have their freedom, but they're worried about whether an aggressive Putin might put them at risk, whether through cyber, whether through subversion strategies, what General Breedlove of NATO has called the little green men, perhaps much more than a traditional set of aggression. Then there's the wider Middle East. This is an issue, again, of world order, because in some ways, what the experts will point out is that the world order for the Middle East was established after World War I, with the state boundaries creation by French and British diplomats, Sykes-Picot. Those borders are totally breaking down now. And so what was a state-centered system with its strengths and weaknesses is now split between Shia and Sunni. It's split at a tribal level. So as I talked about in the piece I wrote for the Wall Street Journal on Friday, in addition to understanding what's going on with the Islamic State, it's important to understand a brutal competition for power among a Shia Persian community that extends across to Assad's regime and Hezbollah, with ISIS, which is offering a Sunni alternative after the Sunnis feel that they've been weakened and therefore it's emphasizes strength and victory. The traditional Sunni states that feel threatened by this. And this is where the Russian intervention adds another combustible piece in the process. So the question is, what, if anything, can the United States do in this overall process? Then other developing countries. These are the potential partners of the future. And just as North America often ends up at the second or third card, it's important to recognize a lot of these developing countries, whether the issue is trade or whether it's currency, whether it's environment, they're going to be key players in the future. Now, one of the challenges that many of them face is that highlighted recently by China, which has talked about overcoming the middle income trap. Now, some economists will debate the exact meaning of that term, but here's a way of remembering it. When I was at the World Bank in 2008, we went and looked at the 101 economies we had classified as middle income in 1960. And so 2008, almost 50 years later, of those 101 economies, only 13 had made it to high income, and one was Greece. So you decide whether it's 12 or 13. The question is, what can be done with these countries in terms of infrastructure, services, role of women? Right now, with the commodity decline, a lot of them are struggling, Brazil being an excellent example. But they'll be very important for the future as a role of U.S. foreign policy, and this includes African countries, which fall into different categories, some resource dependent, linked to governance, some kind of potential cheetahs for growth, and some are post-conflict and fragile states. So to close, let me just step back on this. I've tried to give you a geopolitical view of the world with a little bit of economics and a little bit of history. But the key point that will be part of America's debate this year and in the years to come is, so does the United States see itself as a leader in this system? In my experience over Bush 41, Reagan administration, Bush 43, World Bank, the United States is the only country that has the economic, the political, and the security capacity to catalyze coalitions and groups, but it can't do it on its own. So part of the challenge is the United States is most effective when it works through institutions, when it creates alliances, when it creates new partnerships. And that brings you right back to this architecture I've talked about, how one will modernize that for the new set of challenges. So I'll just close where I began, which is to thank all of you, because one thing, as somebody who's been a little bit on the fringe of politics along with the policy side, I know from, particularly as a trade representative, none of this works unless the American public are behind it. And so what you do in your communities, the debates, the discussions, the interests you have, is critically important for the U.S. role in the world, which I hope will be one of leading and catalyzing the adaptation of this system for the future. Thank you.
Well, that's a pretty comprehensive tour of the horizon.
I disagree. No.
But let's continue the conversation. I will. My approach will be enlightened by two experiences. Bob mentioned the debate in Milwaukee on Tuesday night. One of the things I think we learned there is that it's remarkable how many good things can happen if you just ask somebody a question and let them answer it. So that's what I also learned over time, traveling around the world when Bob was at the State Department, and we spent time going into hotel rooms in distant, far-flung countries, Lithuania, Oman probably, and would go into hotel rooms with Dennis Ross, who you heard from earlier, and Bob Zoellick, that if you ask those guys a question and you stop and just listen, you'll learn a lot. So that's my approach here today. Bob, you in your conversation now about both history and the current environment, you sort of intertwined security themes and economic themes. You gave a speech recently in Philadelphia in which you made an interesting point, which I hadn't thought about that much, about the historic connection between those two things. And what you said specifically was that, I believe that the rise of the national security concept after World War II diminished America's appreciation of the economic dimension of foreign policy, and that we now need to rediscover our heritage of relating economics to our security. And I think that's an interesting point, because in the grand sweep of American history, those two things were much more connected before World War II than they have been since. So my question for you to start the conversation is, how does the next president reconnect economic interests and security policy in a more coherent way?
Well, first, thanks for asking the question. And this is something I hope all of you take back with you, because when you will watch debates on foreign policy, they will often focus on use of force or security issues. And I remember in the last election, there wasn't a question about the Eurozone, even though that was pretty darn important to the fate of our closest ally and partner and its institutions. People tend to say, well, that's an economic issue, or trade. That's an economic issue. It's not a foreign policy issue. But as you could even see from my sort of quick run through these things, I think the two are integrally related. And of course, the economics profession has somewhat seeded this. So, they tend to focus on, quantitative easings and stimulus policies. But we used to have a discipline called political economy, where we try to think how these things interacted. And what Jerry is referring to, I gave a speech up at Philadelphia this week where I reviewed, and I'll save you this, kind of 150 years of how these were very integrally related. And then when I talk about the national security state, what I'm really referring to is, if you look at the National Security Act in 1947, so this is right after World War II, Harry Truman responding to sort of the idea of the Soviet Union, the communist bloc, you'll see that economics is discussed as a resource to be deployed. It's like a static accounting, as opposed to the idea that economic success creates its own dynamic. And one little window on that is, when they created the National Security Council, they didn't even put the Secretary of Treasury in as a statutory member. So you have CIA, you have NSC, you have State, Defense. Now, over time, Secretaries of Treasury have been invited to participate, but it shows a bit of a mindset of economics. And then as I went through some of the points in our discussion, it's kind of hard to imagine that Europe would have succeeded without the types of things of Marshall Plan or open economy. So I think this has also been reflected, as Jerry knows and Roma knows, a little bit in career paths. I mean, a lot of the people you've seen kind of dominating the scene will have come up in the Cold War. They're either Soviet specialists, they were weapons experts, they might have a sense of some of Asia and kind of the Middle East. Didn't really have so much an economic background. Interestingly, two very successful secretaries of state, George Shultz and James Baker, were secretaries of the Treasury and had sort of that different dimension. So its applicability today is the things I really touched on. One, starts at home, but a key message is, it's not only a question of, can we grow more and have higher per capita incomes, but it's a question of, do we keep a society that keeps that dynamism? So a little anecdote to drive this home. I was at the World Bank in the financial crisis, and as the Wall Street Journal and others reported, there was a period where the Chinese were kind of feeling their oats, saying, oh, well, the teachers kind of learned some lessons. But if you go to China today and you talk to them about the US, there's sort of a grudging recognition that somehow the United States has pulled itself back up in this. Now, there's a big issue, and this will be the subject for sort of future Wall Street Journal political debates with candidates. My view is that on the private sector side, we continue to innovate. As you look with the energy sector or software or big data, robotics, bioengineering, I think we're a little stuck on the structural change on the public sector. Tax reform, what we deal with growth of entitlements policies, trade, immigration would be four sort of categories that I would highlight. So we have to get our act together on that, but we have to do so in ways that also think about our partnership with the structure I mentioned. So let me give you another example. The president just completed the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations in trade. It took a long time to get acceptance of Canada and Mexico in that, which I think was a mistake because I'm trying to would encourage North America as the economic unit. And when we are negotiating with Europe, we're not doing so with Canada and Mexico. So for some of you with an industrial background, you'll be well aware that if you go to Canada, people say, we don't have an auto industry, we have an auto parts industry. And if you look at the auto industry in North America, it's very much integrated between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. So if you're negotiating standards and rules for autos, that's going to be very critical if you've got your partners at the table. So what I've touched on with the developing states, or frankly, we talk about the end of the Soviet Union, obviously it was important that the West showed its security strength. There was the dual track decision, which is in the news a little bit. This is where the US and Europe agreed to put in the cruise missiles and the Pershing missiles to counter the Soviet middle-range missiles, with the idea of a negotiation which led to the INF, Intermediate Nuclear Forces, elimination of zero. It's in the press because Helmut Schmidt, who was the courageous German leader who started this process and whose government fell because of it, was one of the kind of leaders of that. But the question is sort of going forward, what will be kind of our relationship economically with issues of cyber information technology and others going forward. And so I think, at least as I would see the foreign policy, the main point is whenever you start to hear about defense spending or what we're going to do in the Middle East or kind of the rise of China, try to ask yourself a range of economic questions that are related to the national security.
So here, by the way, I want to leave some time at the end for some questions from you. Also keep that in mind as we talk. But Bob, here's the fly in the ointment, I think, that you're just describing. So we are clearly in a period of economic globalization of trade, of markets, of energy flows. At the same time that it's hard not to conclude that we're experiencing at least a little bit of isolationist sentiment here, a certain amount of perhaps even xenophobia, and not just here, but also in Europe as well. So in this period of globalization colliding with nationalism and maybe even isolationism, who wins out? Which concept wins out?
It's up to them and the people they represent. No, it's very critical. And let me give you, I'm trying to avoid my political biases in here, but they'll inevitably show up, but so I'll have full disclosure. But let me give you an example. I talked about both immigration and trade. What you saw in the Republican debate is a big division within the Republican Party about those who say, from economic and foreign policy perspective, as well as sort of an ethical one, how do we deal with the future challenges of immigration and people that are already here? You know, are they a potential resource? How do we have rule of law? What do we do with border protection? That's a big debate. And some Republicans are paying a price with their party's base because they're taking on that issue. They probably also think it's good politics in the general election because no Republicans are going to win unless they get up the numbers from the 27% Hispanic support that Romney had. Take the Democratic side. Secretary Clinton came out when she was secretary 45 times, according to one publication, Bloomberg, I think, to support the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But now she opposes it. Well, why does she oppose it? Because the trade unions are a very important part of her political base, and she's worried about being outflanked on her left, so she takes that position. So ultimately, it does depend on the courage, convictions, and in some ways, I hope, the good fortunes of political leaders to say how they're going to engage on these issues. But ultimately, their willingness to do so depends on whether they get some public support on these topics. As a stronger political matter, and again, we'll use immigration as an example, you know, for those Republicans that are more open to immigration, they, of course, need to recognize there's legal and there's illegal. And if you're going to defend legal immigration, you have to deal something with illegal immigration. And so I don't think politically one is going to be able to get far on the legal immigration issue and dealing with the sort of the legacy of the past until you're pretty clear about being able to prevent people. And by the way, you know, contrary to Donald Trump, what the data showed last year is there's fewer Mexicans, there's the flow of Mexicans is actually negative now.
Yeah, it's almost 10 years at a time, the immigration debate that we're having right now.
But you also, that's why I even talked about Central America and the importance of stability in that area. Well, similarly on the trade issue, you have to help people adjust to change. So look, I'm a very strong believer in free trade for the reasons I mentioned, economic, foreign policy, and others. But on the Republican side, you have to say, you know, what can you do that helps those that lose their jobs? And frankly, the United States spends a huge sum of money. I think it's about $21 billion on training programs. A Republican reformer, and there are some who've made this point, would say, how can we use that money better to help people make the adjustment?
Let me take you to a couple of specific places where some of these trends collide, and you spent a lot of time in recent years thinking about China. Let me take you there to the South China Sea. Question I have on that front is the tension over and the potential conflict over the South China Sea and the islands therein, is that an argument about economics or about security?
Well, it's a combination, and it's also about history. So just to give another little advertisement, some of you may have read this, but the origin, at least in modern times, of the debate on the South China Sea stems from an unintended consequence. This is one of the wonderful things about policy. It turns out that after World War II, when the United States wanted to support Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China, one of the things we did was we gave them about 7 surplus destroyers. Well, Chiang Kai-shek is fighting for his life against Mao Zedong on land. What's he going to use the destroyers for? So he sends them on a mapping mission to the South China Sea. And the 9-dash line that you see printed in the newspapers, which looks rather extensive, actually starts with 1947, the Republic of China. So when I had lunch with the Taiwanese representative here, he pointed out one of the other ironies is the maps of that are actually in Taipei. They're not in Beijing. This does have a political effect for...
Perhaps this explains this week's summit meeting, right?
Yeah, he's trying to get the information.
Yeah, right.
But it's an interesting example, not trying to sort of give room to Xi Jinping on this, but at a time that a guy's trying to consolidate power, have the legitimacy of the Communist Party, strengthen the overall economy, does he want to look softer on the South China Sea than Chiang Kai-shek did in 1947? That's one of the issues. Now, the key issue from the United States, at least according to my view, is that we need to focus on the principles going back to this geopolitical structure of freedom of navigation, movement in the seas. So, and I think the Obama administration has taken this position. It's now executing it through some actions. We don't really have a view whether the island belongs to Vietnam or Malaysia or the Philippines or others. We would like that decided peacefully. We hope that it's not a basis of conflict. We tend not to favor the militarization. But what we're trying to emphasize is Number one, if you've taken a reef that under international law didn't qualify as an island, and you build it into an island, then you don't get the 12-mile national space. So that was what the recent destroyer trip was about. But it was also to demonstrate that it's important for not only the security in the region, but for the economic lifelines of energy that flow to Japan, to Korea, the whole international trading system. I forget the exact numbers, but it's like 40 or 50% of the oil in the world moves through the Straits of Malacca, that strait system. So it's, and one other point to connect it to my earlier comments, the U.S. will obviously be more effective if it can do this not just as the United States, but also with Australia, Japan, Singapore, others in the region. And that requires a little bit of diplomatic sensitivity because the Southeast Asian countries want the United States to be there. They want it to be creating an offset to the Chinese power, but they don't really want to get in a big fight with China. They don't want to return to a containment idea. So that's where the devil's in the details.
So you once gave a speech in which you famously said that the way for China to move smoothly into a newly ascendant China to move smoothly into the international system, economic and political, was to act as a responsible stakeholder. That was the phrase you used. It's kind of been out there ever since. The question I have for you is whether China at this point is acting as that responsible stakeholder that you were calling for.
I think the record is mixed, but people might also have a little sense of kind of, well, why does this idea matter? This was a speech I gave in 2005 when I was at the State Department, and I was the lead on a strategic dialogue with China. And I gave a speech trying to frame some of the thoughts on this. And what I was partly reflecting is, some of you may remember, in the 90s, much of the U.S. international community kind of coalesced around the idea of bringing China into the WTO, into the rules-based system for economics, good for China. Premier Zhu Rongji used it to drive reforms, also good for the international system. And that was kind of the organizing device for the domestic politics related to China. We accomplished that in 2001, along with Taiwan coming in, I might add. I was USTR that completed it. Charlene Barshevsky, my predecessor in the Clinton administration, had done the bilateral agreement with the United States. But I was then thinking, what should be the next organizing device for our ideas? And my perspective was that since Deng Xiaoping had come to power in 1978, China had done very well with this international system that the United States had helped create. It was relying on its exports, on the capital inflows. So China, as it got bigger, even though it was a developing country, should assume responsibilities in the system. Now, in the battle of politics, this becomes a bit of a ping pong match, because some people say, oh, I was saying China was a responsible stakeholder, which I didn't. And in some ways, even the position that I gave obviously leans heavily towards the U.S. perspective, because I was leaving the U.S. to decide whether China is a responsible stakeholder. It's a little hard to object to that. On the other hand, China, while it recognized this, saw some benefits of saying, well, as there are new issues, then we have to have a say in the rules and the process. So a scorecard. Well, I mentioned in some of the security areas, South China Sea, cyber, you've got issues. Cyber is partly a problem, though, is that we're making up the rules as we go. In some ways, this is very crudely analogous to nuclear weapons in the late 40s, when some people thought they were bigger artillery shells and bigger bombs, and all of a sudden in the 50s, people started to develop theories of deterrence and others. And just to give you another little anecdote on this, from my experience, but also the Obama administration, I know this is a shock to all of you, but countries spy, and there's a thing called espionage. And so while we don't like it, and we don't like it when it kind of goes overdone, one of the things that we had to communicate to the Chinese was saying, look, we understand there's a thing called espionage, but commercial espionage, when you steal from companies, that we don't do, that's unacceptable. So the Chinese go back and they say, okay, if I get the information on the F-35, if I get the secret profiles of all your staff, you don't like it, but that's acceptable part of the rules, but I can't steal from an American company. Is that right? Is that kind of the, and so, not surprisingly, that takes a little bit of adjustment. Now, this process that President Obama's launched, we'll see. If you want to be an optimist, we had a similar discussion with the Chinese back in the 80s and 90s on nuclear nonproliferation. And Not surprisingly, the Chinese had some businesses that were linked to this. They had some nasty friends, and it kind of took a while to get them to say, well, look, this stuff is dangerous, so you need to cooperate with this. We'll see, and I think all sides have to work on the cyber. On the economics, let me just say this quickly. If you look at the financial crisis, whether you think it was a good thing or not, the United States and China had very big stimulus policies. There's a wonderful story in Hank Paulson's book about how the Russians went to the Chinese and said, look, you know, this is the moment to really squeeze the United States. We hold a lot of these dollars. Let's dump them. And the Chinese say, I don't think that's a very good idea. You know, we're kind of invested in this system. You go off and do something else for a while. If you look in trade, you know, if you look at America's farmers, by the way, people will discover this in Iowa with pork and corn and others and grains. You're from Kansas, a lot of sales there. So on the trade, the picture has got a lot of benefits, but there's still some things that are closed. A good example of attention was the Chinese came up with an idea for something called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And the United States opposed it. And I think this was a mistake. Number one, it's not a good idea in diplomacy to oppose things where you're almost certain to lose. But then secondly, you know, in some ways, in most of my diplomatic career, countries said to the United States, we want you to spend on this with your money. This time the Chinese are bringing their money. And actually the guy who was setting up the bank was coming to the US and the World Bank and try to deal with governance and environmental other rules. So the other part of it is when China brings a good idea, well, you know, maybe we can go along with it too. So this, in some ways, the responsible stakeholder, which I think Vice President Biden actually used this year too, kind of defines the framework. To give you one other point on this, many people will say, well, China now says, look, our view of the world is different. We're going to define our own international system. So if we had Henry Kissinger here, he would be skeptical of this notion because from a security perspective, he says, China has always seen itself as the Middle Kingdom. It has tributary relations. It doesn't fit into an integrated system. What's interesting is you could see a lot of examples where China has done that in the economic area, the security area, less well developed.
So let me ask one other question, then we'll open it up to yours. And it's hard not to go to the Middle East, just given everything that's happening there today. But let me go there in a way that brings together these two themes we've been talking about, security and economics, in the following way. There is emerging a potential, and you wrote about this in the op-ed piece you did for the Journal, a kind of Shiite, Iranian, Russian, Hezbollah axis in that region, particularly in Syria. It has the potential to be a spot where the Russians can expand their influence, maybe even dramatically in the region. The question that's emerging in the political debate, which isn't really crystallized yet, but you can start to hear it, is why should we care? We don't need their oil anymore. If the Syrian mess is as bad as it looks and it's going to be a quagmire, let it be the Russians' quagmire. We don't have to worry about it this time. The Iranians are the Iranians. We'll figure out ways to contain them. Why should we care? What's the answer to that question?
Well, your question kind of stated this, and a little bit my race through my opening presentation stated this. Keep in mind, it's not just a quarrel among tribes. This is a fundamental power struggle for who's going to be dominant in this region of the world, okay? And we've touched on some of the different players. Now, the question is, does the United States want to influence that? Does the United States think that even if it can't dictate it, that it wants to have leverage in whatever diplomacy comes out of it? Does it want to have people on our side, to be blunt? Does it want to have things that give it some ability to counter those that it sees as most dangerous? So what in particular are the interests? Well, start with Israel. The United States has a moral, ethical, historical protection of Israel, and so that's in the Middle East. Are we willing to abandon Israel? Second, as we've seen the effect on European stability now with the refugees, what comes out of Middle East won't stay in the Middle East. It's going to flood and affect other areas, and that includes Islamic terrorism. So if part of the idea of the Islamic State, unlike Al-Qaeda, is to control land and territory, to have a caliphate, the motto of ISIS under kind of building on Islamic law is endure and expand, and they mean it. So whether it looks towards North Africa, whether it looks towards Egypt, whether it looks towards Saudi Arabia and others. So do we care whether people will have a base that will draw Islamic jihadic terrorists to be able to train, operate, and expand, whether in Europe, whether in other Jordan, whether in the Sunni states. This is one of the reasons why Russia is obviously concerned. Energy. Yes, the United States, if we have the right policies, could move in a North American context to more energy efficiency, but oil is a global market. And so the price of energy here is going to be dependent on what energy is there. And so here's another question. Maybe China's more dependent on that energy. So would America feel comfortable if we moved the Sixth Fleet out of the Mediterranean and the force in the Persian Gulf and said, well, China, you go take care of this area? Or would there be a worry that what might come out of it might not be in our interest? So those are some of the interests that are kind of moral, economic, security relation. And what I was actually trying to do in this piece that I wrote for the Journal was say that the part of the problem is people are struggling with the brutality of the Islamic State. But keep in mind, there's a bigger power struggle going on here. And just to connect this back to public opinion, what I found interesting, you probably know more data on this, is that not surprisingly, after the long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was a sense of withdrawal, people being tired of this. The beheadings of the Islamic State really moved the whole dial on this, because I guess people just said, look, this is so brutal, there has to be a limit on this. And what I also found intriguing was that when you ask people, well, do you think what we would do will make much difference? They were kind of commonsensical, and they said, well, I'm not so sure, this is a really hard problem, but we just can't let this go on and spread.
Yeah, and just as a footnote, the argument that you're starting to hear articulated by Donald Trump in particular is, okay, fine, that's true, but $1.5 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan, enough already, and that's, I think, going to take off. But let me stop there and just, I think we have time literally for 2 questions, maybe 3 from the audience. So I think there are microphones coming around. I'm going to start right there.
And maybe if you would just introduce yourself and where you're from.
Thank you. Marty Jones, the World Affairs Council of Jacksonville. During the debates, for the first time in my recollection, the Federal Reserve is coming under incredible increased attacks, and looking at the transparency of the Fed, also the independence of the Fed. I believe there's a bill pending on the Federal Reserve Transparency Act. Do you feel that this is an issue? And if a bill like this passed, what do you think the implications could be?
Yeah, great question. An important topic. And what it really stems back to, and I had this conversation with Ben Bernanke at the time. You know, we have a democratic system. It's a little unusual where we create some independent technocratic institution and give it great power. And that's what you do with the Federal Reserve. So part of my argument to Ben early on was, look, it's important to preserve the independence of your monetary policy. So be careful. People, and I've watched this in my career, people will push more and more stuff on you, but I'd be careful of doing that because some of those are political issues. You may be able to deal with them, competently with your staff, but it'll come back to haunt you. And by the way, this is an issue kind of more broadly in the system. Second, we've been through an extraordinary period of first fiscal and monetary policies. In fact, so tomorrow morning I'll be speaking to a group of chief investment officers in Arizona, and part of my starting point is when you live in such an era, it's natural that you treat the abnormal as commonplace. But historically, these monetary policies really are kind of highly experimental. And so the question will be, you see this debate in the editorial page or the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal, kind of, have we gone too far? How does it distort asset prices? In a simple way, do we need a handoff to a private sector growth model? And we could talk more about sort of what that's involved. But so the Federal Reserve, some would argue through the demands, had to take unusual policies that are playing back, even in the monetary area, across the broader economic side. And so then the bills that you asked about, they're different types, but one is kind of audit the Fed. As Janet Yellen would tell you if you were here, the Fed is audited, but this is an idea that would kind of allow Congress to play a greater role in observing and commenting on the monetary policy. This is a debate that runs through American history. I mean, it runs through Jackson ending the second bank of the United States. It's with the creation of the Federal Reserve System the way that it is. Remember, you have Janet Yellen or other Federal Reserve chairmen testify twice a year, called the Humphrey Hawkins testimony, to the House and the Senate. That comes from a bill that was passed in the late 70s that said we want more congressional involvement. So this will be a core issue, and you'll see it in part because the Fed is likely to start to increase interest rates. Big debate whether December or a little later. The market now believes 70% likely December. And I think this will start to lead to a greater differentiation of asset prices, which right now have all been dispersed because of the flood of money. That's going to lead into a whole series of discussion. So, good question. Oh, by the way, one small thing, since Rennie, Sebastian Mallaby, who used to write for The Economist and the Financial Times, a wonderful writer, is working on a book that'll be it's a biography of Alan Greenspan, and it's coming out next year. The reason I know is he asked me to read chapters. And it's a wonderful book for lay people because he explains the debates about monetary policy in a way that I think would be generally understood for this audience in particular, and it's kind of its relation to the Fed, to kind of the independence, the policy questions about asset price and inflation. So in my spirit of history, I sometimes find biography as a good way of telling the bigger story, and he's done an excellent job of talking about monetary policy within the framework of Alan Greenspan. So put that on your next spring list.
As a footnote, I would just add that in the debate that I moderated on Tuesday, I asked Chris Christie a question about Fed policy. The question I asked was essentially, by keeping interest rates so low for so long, is the Fed creating asset bubbles that are going to burst and create big problems down the line, or was it right to err on the side of making sure the recovery was finished? He immediately answered by saying, well, the reason interest rates have been so long is that the Fed has been politicized, and it's basically doing the bidding of Barack Obama. I didn't ask about politicizing the Fed. He went straight there himself. I think the question is, if you bring Congress in to audit the Fed, is that really a recipe for making it less politicized? I don't get it. But anyway, there's one here somewhere? Right there.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Valery Charlie. I'm Ambassador of Ukraine to the United States. First of all, Mr. Zoellick, thank you very much, not only for your personal contribution to the European integration in Germany, but also for my country. We count on your continuous support.
I wrote a piece for his paper on you, too.
My question about the taxpayers. Usually we are responsible for something. You pay 7 seconds for Ukraine and just simple note to use Canada or Australia because they are not the troublemakers. We have another countries who is the troublemakers in the world. Why we every time have such a not active, not proactive policy, but responding for the conflicts, for the new challenges and threat? How to use international economic system, how to use other mechanisms to avoid such a challenge as a conflict. Do you think we have additional tools now for that? Especially, for example, Russian-Ukraine conflict. What's your proposal? How to use international economic tools for that? It's not about sanctions yet. It's about the more broader context. Thank you.
Yeah, a very good question. And the types of things I discussed here at sort of lightning speed can help perhaps prevent some problems. They can help, a big challenge in diplomacy is the need to anticipate. We were talking about German unification. One of the lessons for me that I talk about is how it's very hard to predict specific events, but you can anticipate trends. And fortunately, we were about 5 or 6 months ahead on that one, and so we kind of positioned the United States in a certain way. Having said that, a lot depends on what will be done with the people in the country themselves do. And so, as you know, part of the challenge for Ukraine was in 1992 or 93, your estimated per capita income levels weren't that different than Poland. And, sad to say, with different political fights and others, Poland followed a reform path. Ukraine couldn't quite manage that despite the heroic efforts of various people. So one big question will be, I think you can get support from the United States and Europe and others if you make the tough economic reforms. The reason I wrote the piece was you have a finance minister, Natalie Jaresko, by the way, Ukrainian-American, who's assumed Ukrainian citizenship, who's trying to do that. Secondly, security. Look, this goes back to one of Jerry's points. There'll be a sensitivity here because one of the big issues of debate should Ukraine have been part of NATO? Okay, I supported NATO's enlargement, but I also felt it was very important that people face up to a serious question, which is if we bring countries into NATO, we have to mean it, and that means we have to defend them, and that means that the young men and women of America have to be willing to put their lives on the line for that defense, okay? I don't think that the American public are willing to die for Ukraine. The fact of the matter is. Now, what I believe is that if Ukraine is in a position where it takes the economic reforms and the courageous democratic reforms, we should be more forward-leaning about helping Ukraine fight for themselves. And this is a difference of view with the administration and myself. Chancellor Merkel, for example, says there's no military solution. I think that's a bit of a sleight of phrase. In many aspects of life, it's a combination of how military actions create facts on the ground that lead to a diplomatic solution. So coming back to the case of Ukraine, my own belief is that Putin is a ruthless pragmatist. And I first met him when he was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg back in 91, 92. I worked with him on a number of occasions. And what I mean by ruthless pragmatist is that both words apply. He will operate in ways that would be outside the values of people in this room, or at least I hope. And you saw that by taking Crimea. But pragmatist is that he will also calculate costs. And so my point about helping Ukraine be armed is, I don't believe you're going to beat the Russian army. I do believe that you can increase the risks and therefore increase the deterrence and therefore lead more likely to a political solution. But to give you one last point on this, when I was at the World Bank, and at an earlier point, Ukraine was trying to make some economic reforms. And this was under a prime minister that had sort of a mixed sort of reputation, but I felt she was trying to do some tough things. I remember going, I had the resources of the World Bank, and we had our team working with her to make these decisions, and I said, look, if you do this step, I'll give you some support, that'll help you get through the RADA. So we're trying to build a process of economic strengthening. And I remember going to Chancellor Merkel and saying, look, Ukraine is important to you. Will you help me with this? And she said, oh, go talk to President Obama. Well, so I didn't get help from either of them, and we are where we are.
I do remember the trip to St. Petersburg you were talking about, and I think Mayor Sobchak was running to St. Petersburg, and Putin was one of his deputies, and those were going to be the great Russian democratic reformers. And
right.
History is a funny way of
turning it
out.
back. Yeah.
Exactly. Bob, thank you. It's 2 o'clock. I know you've got a plane to catch. I've learned a lot. I suspect the audience agrees with me. Thank you very much, and thanks, Roman, for having us both here.